Good morning. We have a teeny tiny little group today. So I am actually going to hit the buttons here to allow you guys to talk anytime that you want to. Give me just a second, I'll try to keep up with that. And Mary, you are on kind of an older version of Zoom, so I have to actually promote you to a panelist, which seems a little weird, but it's not going to change anything on your end, but it will allow you to unmute in case you want to. Because I think this really could be a topic that would be great for some discussion. So I'll try to keep an eye on if we have anybody else join a little bit later and make sure and unmute them. So good morning, my name is Angie McKinney, and I'm a consultant with the Indiana IEP Resource Center. I am presenting today on a little bit related to goal writing for speech language pathologists and related services providers. And then also kind of rethinking how we do inclusive services. Traditionally, it's not been the most inclusive kind of model in most of our related services and in providing speech. So we're going to look at it a little bit differently, and hopefully you're going to walk away from today thinking, maybe I could just do this one thing, or maybe I could just take this approach and just change things slightly. So as we go through this, I don't want you to be thinking that that I'm asking you to turn over your practice tomorrow and do something dramatically different. It's a slow process. It's a slow change in order for this to actually happen. We do have captioning available. So if you would like to see the captions, if you would go to your toolbar and just click the CC button, you should be able to see the captions as they happen. And this is a link to a Padlet, which is where you can find a copy of the handout. Now, this is an online version, so our training today is a virtual version. So we can't cover as much in 90 minutes as we would in a full day. But your handout includes some of the additional slides that we're really not going to be able to cover, but you can still have that information available. I'm going to type it in the chat as well, and that way if you would like to click on it, you'll be able to see what's there. Beyond the handout, there are some additional documents in there that we'll refer to here and there, as well as some handouts that you might be able to use with your staff, with your parents, with your administrators, some different websites. And then I'll also refer you to a list of really helpful articles. And rather than just have a list of those links, those have been uploaded to the Padlet as well. So check that out when you get a chance. I'd like to start with a cartoon. We'd all like to start our day with a cartoon, but this one I think is really, really meaningful. And it's Pooh and Piglet. And Piglet says, "How do you do inclusion?" And Pooh says, "You don't do it, you live it." And that is so incredibly true. We have used a lot of terms within education as kind of a verb, like we RTI kids, we do inclusion, or we've used it as an adjective such as, well, this is an inclusion classroom. This is an inclusion course. When that's not really what inclusion is about. Inclusion is a mindset, a culture, a belief system, and it truly is something that you live. And we never quite get there. We hope that we can eventually get there, but we really never quite do. And I want to kind of demonstrate today some of the different possibilities in how we deliver services and how we might want to rethink things. So this is what our agenda looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about least restrictive environment. If you're in the field, you've heard the term LRE over and over and over again. You heard it in school, you heard it in practice, but we're going to talk about what it really means and what the law says. A little bit about the mindset behind inclusive practices and some of the thinking. And then we'll start looking at some goals and how to write goals and how to think about your goals so that they are meaningful, they're measurable, and that they can be accomplished with inclusive services. Then we'll also look at co-teaching models, not in great depth, but in enough depth that you can understand where you might be able to tap into some existing co-teaching or create some new opportunities for co-teaching where you can get the IEP needs met for students, but also support more students. There's definitely no harm in students that don't have an IEP benefiting from all the resources and the expertise and the wisdom that's out there. We'll share some information about communicating. This is one of those topics that communication is can be a big barrier for us, but can also help make services go more smoothly, both in the delivery and in sharing the information about why we're doing what we're doing, why we want to make some changes, and just how this all happens. And then finally, we'll wrap up at the end of that 90-minute session. I have marked you all so that you can unmute. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and jump in, or you can type something in the chat. I have that up and so that I can keep an eye on that as well. So we're going to start with thinking about LRE. And here's what the law says. Pretty much word for word, copy pasted straight out of Article 7. It says when we're talking about least restrictive environment, we know that that's different for every kid. What is my least restrictive environment may be different than what you need as the least restrictive environment. And it says that to the maximum extent appropriate. Now that's a little tricky, right? The maximum that we can get that's still appropriate. Students with disabilities, and that's talking about no matter where they are educated with non-disabled students. Okay, so that's kind of the thinking behind it is if we can do it as much as we can, we need to have students that have disabilities out there getting their services, getting educated in with their non-disabled peers. It goes on to say that we're only going to use the other stuff, right? Special classes, separate schools, any removal of students from their typical peers. We're only going to do that if the nature and severity of that disability is such that doing it in the gen ed classroom with the use of supplementary aids and services can't be satisfactorily achieved. Okay, that seems kind of simple, but that's not our typical practice. I mean, think about, some of the IEP meetings that you've been in over the course of the last couple of years, and think about some of the conversation that happens. If we think about removing a student from the general education setting, from their general education peers, many times it's something really small. We're going to pull you out for 20 minutes twice a week for speech therapy. We're going to pull you out 3 times a month into the occupational therapy room to get support. We're going to pull you out to get some intensive reading support in the resource room. Okay, that sounds like what we do a lot of times, right? Because we think that those things need to occur in that other setting, and sometimes they do. Okay, so there is always the possibility that that is the most appropriate place. But we go from here in the gen ed classroom to here in a different room or a different location without sometimes thinking of that middle piece, which is, could we do it in that gen ed room if we use supplementary aids and services? Is there a way to make it happen and make it happen well within that general education setting? And I know that that step is often left out, and it's straight in the law that we need to think about those things. So we do have a full continuum of things that we could possibly do, and it kind of looks like this. And there's more in between, more variations, but you can see it ranges along a continuum from being in the general education classroom to being in the general education classroom with some supports and services happening there, to even being in the general education classroom with maybe a full-time aide. That's still less restrictive in the sense of the LRE continuum. To, as you move along that arrow, you may need a little bit of time away from your peers, to lots of time away from your peers, to really far away from your peers in a separate school or a separate kind of facility, all the way to a residential facility where it's not just I go there during the day, but I stay there. And then finally, the most restrictive, and this probably seems a little wrong. It's hard to kind of wrap your brain around this, but the most restrictive is considered homebound or hospital setting. The reason being that if I would naturally think in my head that a residential placement would be even more restrictive, but in many residential placements, you're going to be mixed in with other kids, sometimes kids with IEPs, sometimes a mix of kids with and without IEPs, but you're in with other students versus many times on a homebound or a hospital placement, you are coming either into the library or coming after school, but you're not with other kids. We basically said you can't be educated with other people in the school setting or in a typical school setting, and we're going to have to do something different. So that's what the continuum looks like. And we always want to edge towards that green end of the arrow when we can. But again, we know we have some students who the appropriate and the least restrictive environment at the time in their situation is something that is more on the right-hand side. So lots of different ways that we can kind of look at this. Now, when we think about what exactly inclusion is, we know that education has changed over the years. Education has changed because the laws have changed, the practices have changed. And, you know, when I went to school, well, let me go back even further. When my mother was in school, my mother's in her 70s now, and when she was in school, the kids who had disabilities that might have come from the community, they didn't go to school. They were excluded from school. And when I was in elementary, I can remember there was a special ed room. We didn't know what went on in that room, but there was a special ed room. And many of the students who went into that room had some pretty significant disabilities. We weren't talking about learning disabilities or a little ADHD or, you know, anything like that. We were talking about kids who had intellectual disabilities, big time medical conditions, you know, things like that. But they kind of went into that room and we didn't see them until it was time to go home. And that's kind of what that second little petri dish looks like. Is we've got a gen ed classroom and then we have a pocket of kids and they aren't really in the room. We've moved to a little bit more inclusive practices where we have those kids coming into the room, but many times when we group or when we work with them, we're working with them separately. pulling kids to the back table. And a lot of times that's what we've seen in a lot of our related services and speech and language services, that we may go into a classroom, but many times we pull the kids that have those specific needs on their IEP to a back corner or to a side table and provide services there. Sometimes inclusion looks a little more mixed. We go into a classroom, kids are mixed in their groups, and you're really providing services to anyone that needs it. That final Petri dish is a little bit different, and I really think nobody is there yet. Nobody that I know of is there yet. But it's where you can't really tell. There isn't a non-disabled and a disabled marking, right? We recognize in that final representation that everyone just has differences. Everyone has different strengths, different challenges. We appreciate all of those, and we do whatever is needed, regardless of label, regardless of disability, regardless of language background, socioeconomic status, skin color. Nothing matters other than you're bringing gifts to this classroom, and we're capitalizing on those. So let's think about, what do your services look like? And I'm just going to ask you to type in the chat any of the services that you see happening, whether you're providing them or things that are happening out there in some of your colleagues. What letters do you see happening in your district or in your school? And if you would, make sure and change the drop down in the chat so that it says everyone and not just presenters or hosts. So what does it look like now for you? B and C. We're starting to see a lot more B and C. B, C, and D, absolutely. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Yeah, there's a mix, and there's a need for a mix because some skills happen better when they're outside of the classroom, but some skills could happen better within that general education setting, but we've always done it as a B or a D, right? When I would push to create more of that C time so that it is more inclusive. And we're going to talk about why. But first, we're going to look at mindset. Changing mindset is hard. And part of what we think about with mindset is there's a big difference in how things happen outside of the school setting when we're using that medical model versus what happens in the educational setting. And you guys know this much better than I do because you've probably had these conversations, fought this fight in trying to explain why a student might qualify for physical therapy outside of school, but they don't in school, or why they might qualify for speech through their insurance, but they don't necessarily qualify under Article 7 for an articulation disorder. There are a lot of differences, and how we write goals are very different as well, because we're writing goals for life-changing kinds of things. We're writing goals to help make sure that we are reducing that educational impact and that we are pushing kids one more step forward in being able to do those meaningful things in the school setting that are so important. So like I said, there are quite a few different articles that can be really helpful with some of this thinking. And again, we don't have time to go through these, but if you go to the Padlet, all of these are uploaded, so you can find all of these. Some are just from a website and some are documents, so you should be able to find all of this on the Padlet. So when you're thinking about that difference between the medical model and the school-based model for how we look at things, what kinds of things are different in your evaluation? Can anyone share what is different in your background of how you would evaluate using a medical model versus how you evaluate based on what Article 7 says? And you're welcome to type something in the chat, but you're also welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like to share.
This is Joretta Snyder. I'm from Lake Central, Grimmel Middle School. I'm not actually an SLP or an OT. I'm the PAR for my middle school and one of the elementaries. However, I see that the related service providers talk about this a lot, and parents really do not have that understanding, but especially in handwriting at the middle school level. However, in terms of the assessment materials that they use, I see it's more school-based. So when the PT is looking or the OT is looking at fine motor, they're doing things at the locker. They're looking to see, can they get their coats done? Can they tie their shoes? Things that would be specific to the school building, not necessarily to the community as a whole. So anything that you guys can share that would, in terms of like the tests that you use, I would have some relation to that, but I wouldn't be able to say we use this test instead of that test. I hope that makes sense.
It definitely does. And what I see are two of the biggest differences. Well, number one, and for any of you who are not in those particular roles, there is a huge difference between speech and language and related services, because speech and language in Indiana, and this is not in every state, but in many states, speech and language is or SI, speech impairment and language impairment, is a primary disability. And as a primary disability, it has some of the, the same characteristics that have to be met through the evaluation, including looking at the academics, because we have to have that academic impact. And ultimately, for any disability, we have to show that there's adverse educational performance. And educational performance, by definition, is talking about academics and or functional. So we do have some kids that their academics are not affected, but their educational performance is affected because their functional skills are so weak. Meaning, I can't communicate with my peers. Maybe I can still read and comprehend and do math and all that kind of stuff, but my social is so affected by my language skills that I would qualify, or my teacher can't understand what I'm saying because my articulation difficulty is so strong. Oh, goodness. Sorry, my screen just gave me a weird little message here. Hang on just one moment. Okay. So there's definitely a difference there, because in an outside setting, typically you would not have a speech language pathologist in order to qualify for somebody in an outside setting looking at their academics, but it's a requirement. Now, the flip side of this, when we're looking at related services, they still have some specific things that we ought to look at related to whether or not somebody needs occupational therapy, physical therapy, blind low vision services, orientation and mobility services. We've got lots of different things that students may require, but a student has to require that related service in order to benefit from their primary educational service. And that's hard for parents to wrap their brains around. which means number one, I have to qualify for one of the eligibility areas first, right? I can't qualify for a related service if I don't qualify for special ed as a whole. But then we also have to say that I need that related service, whatever it may be, in order to benefit from this other stuff that's in my plan, from my primary specially designed instruction, special ed services. And if we can't say yes to that, then technically someone doesn't qualify. And I think a lot of our OTs have probably run into this more than anyone else, that they've said, you know, outside, if I were evaluating you in a clinic, you'd probably qualify for occupational therapy, but you don't really need it in order to benefit from what the special ed staff are doing for your primary disability area. We can do without it, which still means that we tell parents, okay, well, you can still pursue this outside of school, but it's very hard for them to understand. But the evaluation process may look different. Many times the evaluation process within a school is kind of determined by the group that are providing those services there. There may be some in-house procedures, but there are not as many specifics about what goes into an evaluation for a related service as there are for those primary disability areas. And then when we determine goals, again, we are looking at goals that aren't related to my service, they're related to the need. Meaning I'm not writing an OT goal, I'm writing a goal for the student that is part of their IEP that may be related to fine motor or sensory. There may be a lot of different things that it could be focused on, but there's not necessarily a need for something that a person can identify as, that's my goal to work on. Because the bottom line is we are all on whatever team that we're on, working on every goal for a student. They're not compartmentalized. And we've kind of had that thinking for a long time that does compartmentalize them of, I've got to maintain this goal. I've got to work on this goal. I've got to progress monitor this goal. But those skills don't happen in isolation. They happen over the course of the day, the week, the year, and in many, many different settings. And so thinking about how we can get kids to have goals that will generalize across those settings is what we're ultimately looking for. So in doing that, we've got to start with our thinking about present levels, because we can't ever write a good goal unless we have good present levels. And some of our present levels maybe aren't so present. We kind of ran into a problem during the height of COVID where many of our kids, we couldn't find them, right? We were trying to have IEP meetings on kids who hadn't been showing up for virtual sessions. We didn't have a lot of new assessment data. And so many of our present levels were kind of past levels. Hopefully that time has passed and we've kind of worked out some of those kinks as we've done the virtual trial and error. And now I think many of us have gotten really good at that. But it is critical that anytime that we have a new IEP meeting, that we update those present levels of academic and functional performance so that we've got a good sense of where are we starting from. Again, that will help drive those goals. We have to make sure that that we're covering both the academic and the functional pieces, and that we're thinking about how these different skills affect access to the general ed curriculum and performance in the general ed curriculum. What's going on with this kid that might keep them from being able to access what everybody else is accessing, and that might change what they really need to have presented to them. So when you do really good present levels, then you're going to get some of those things that help you figure out what in the world should our goals be, right? You should be able to read someone's present levels and think, oh, we need a goal for that, right? Keep in mind, we don't need a goal for everything. Despite what you sometimes hear from maybe a parent who says, oh, we need a goal for that. We need a goal for that. We are writing life-changing kinds of goals for students because all of our students are also working on a ton of other stuff. We don't write goals for all of them. Our special ed teachers, our related service providers, our general ed teachers are all working on multiple things every day. But we're writing goals for the things that we think this is not typical for the grade level or the age level of the student. Other kids have got this, but this particular skill, if I can just over the course of the next year, get this kid to be able to do this, that would change things for the student. That would change their ability to access the curriculum. That would change how they can interact with other students. That would change their life for the better. And we're looking at skills. And again, skills that are meaningful and relevant. I had a case conference with a parent who was having a pretty intense argument with the occupational therapist because she believed that anything that they were working on should have a goal. Otherwise, why do it? So, your occupational therapist, they may use yoga, they may use balance activities, they may use, putty, they may use lots of things, TheraBands, right? They've got lots of things in their bag of tricks. But those things are focused on underlying skills that are important for these kids. Sensory regulation, fine motor skills, stamina, right? That can be a big one for our students. So they're not working on getting better at doing yoga. They're not working on getting better at walking across a beam. And I think that, again, it's a mindset of what are we truly working on and what skills matter, because this kid could go through elementary school, middle school, and high school. And if he can't walk across a balance beam, it doesn't matter. It's not going to change this kid's life, whether or not he can do that skill, but whether or not he can navigate the hallways, whether or not he can stay in his chair without falling out of it because of balance issues or motor control or core control. OTs know what they're working on and they know the tools to get them there, but we're backing it down to the key skills that are important for the student. So again, make sure that when you have present levels that you can look in here. You can look and see that with his math skills, there really isn't going to be a goal coming out of that, right? He's got a lot of good skills. We're not writing about anything that he's struggling with. And your present levels should tell, what can I already do? What have I conquered? What things maybe I am starting to learn, but I'm not real fluent with yet. So we need to keep an eye on those. Or what are those next step skills that we've conquered this? So the next logical thing is for us to work on this, right? So you can see some of these different things that would just naturally lead themselves to being goals that we should work on. So in creating a goal, your goal needs to have 3 different components to it. We need to make sure that, number one, they are skill-based. I mean, that is incredibly important. For many years, I helped write some really horrible goals. And I look back and read some of the goals that I had input on, and I'm like, oh, what was I thinking? Like a goal might say, Johnny will increase his star reading score from this to this. And I'm like, okay, it's got numbers, it's measurable, but I have no idea what skill we're talking about there. Doing better on a test is not a skill. completing homework really is not a skill. We want to look below that and see what skill is this kiddo missing that we want to make sure and teach them how to do. And then we're going to monitor that through a particular goal. So we've got to have some sort of skill. It also needs to be educationally relevant. It needs to be meaningful. It needs to be a life changer. So you've got to have a skill, stimulus, material, or condition under which you'd want to see that, criterion for performance, so that we know when a student actually reaches that, and that's going to turn out to be a measurable goal. And we'll go into each of these a little bit more. But one of the big shifts for some people is getting away from the results of a test to write a goal to what's going on in the classroom as a goal. I'll give you an example. If you're a speech pathologist and you maybe have a test, and one of the areas that the kid really struggled on is antonyms, right? Do you really want to write a goal about antonyms, or do you want to think about why is that important? What skill are we looking at when it comes to understanding language or reading or anything like that might be relevant related to antonyms? There are a lot of things that kind of filter out of some of our assessment tools, and we get all these different subtests, and those subtests sound like, oh, that'd be a great area. They don't often translate very well into really what we're looking at in the schools. So again, got to have the skill. How are you going to show me something? And there's some words that just make it when you're writing a goal, make it a little less clear or a little more clear. So here are some different words that you might want to stay away from, or things that you might want to use. So you can see the column on the left are things that we often use, and we use these all the time in writing different goals, but they're very difficult to see or hear or know whether they've occurred or not. And it makes it very difficult for your IEP to pass that stranger test. So if you're always thinking about, if this kiddo moved down the road, entered into a new school, and somebody gets this IEP, are they going to have the same understanding of what I was talking about as when I wrote it? So things like, we may say, well, the student will recognize blah, blah, blah. Well, how do we know if they've recognized it? Is it that we see a little spark go off and we know I recognized it? That's really hard to see. But if we can use things like, they'll circle it from a choice, they'll touch it, they'll point to it, they'll name it. Those are things that we can witness, and we'll know whether or not the behavior has truly occurred or the skill set is being demonstrated. So that next piece is around the condition or the materials that are needed. So you may see things like, when presented with 3 visual choices, that's a setup that it's not that I would expect for somebody to be able to do a certain skill every time in every setting. I mean, ultimately, we're looking for generalization, but when I'm going to measure something, where do I expect to see this? Under what condition would I expect to see it? Do I need visuals to be able to demonstrate a skill? Because there's a big difference between saying, when provided with 3 visual choices, the student will select the appropriate picture to match a word or to indicate understanding of vocabulary, right? That's 3 visual choices is one thing versus the student will name or point to the correct picture for a vocabulary word from an array of 10 choices. It's a different expectation for what's going on. So sometimes you may have a particular context or time. So you may be talking about in conversation. And I see this a lot in our speech goals, in conversation, in sentences, in words. That is the context that we're talking about, that I want to hear a certain sound. It may be a time of day. For a lot of our behavior goals, we may only expect to see this under certain conditions. You're not going to see me using my coping skills all day, every day, because I only have a need to use those coping skills either when I'm tired or when I'm frustrated or at, peak times, right? But if you try to measure a student using their coping skills 80% of the time in the classroom, number one, you can't sit and monitor that all day. But you want to know, when should I see this? When is a student maybe not using those coping skills and they should be? When are they already using them, but I can't even see that it's happening? Those are tricky kind of, broad goals that make it difficult to even know whether or not somebody is reaching a goal. You may see things like when given an organizational tool, such as an agenda, or when provided with graphic organizers. Those are materials that might be needed in order for a student to demonstrate a skill. When taught to use a communication board, it could be related to some assistive technology that is needed for the student. So again, it's context, environment, and materials that we're looking at. And then you've got to have something that tells us what's the mark. Where is it that we'll say they've reached it? They've reached the goal. So how are we going to know whether it is achieved? And we can use a lot of different ways to identify. We don't have to have 80% as the level that we use all the time. I mean, that's probably the most common thing that you see when you pull an IEP is 80%, 80%, 80%. We can have an accuracy data, but you're always going to make that relative to the student that you're working with because it's individualized. Think about where they start and then think about where you want them to be in a year. It may be a fluency kind of measure, how many per minute. It could be duration. Sometimes we're looking at getting kids to stick with something longer. They'll be able to sit up in their seat for this length of a period of time. And sometimes we're looking at latency too. So the length of time before you start something, the length of time before you respond to a verbal request or something like that. So again, it really has to do with what is appropriate for the skill that you're looking at. What is going to most help you to understand whether or not a student has reached the mark, and making sure that it is very clear. So one of the things that you don't want to do is get into a loop of multiple criteria when you're trying to set that measurability piece. So what I see often is Johnny will complete 4 out of 5 questions with 80% accuracy on 5 of 10 trials, right? And once you start whittling that down, I'm not even close to understanding how it is I would measure that, because it just gets so convoluted in the layers of, 80% of 80% of 20% of, it just gets further and further away where he could almost blink and meet the goal, So we want to keep it simple, keep it very succinct and simple. One of the things that I think is probably most meaningful is when we write a goal that specifically has over so many consecutive assessments. Because, you know, when you look at kids' data, it kind of does this, right? They're all over the place. And so this week we were at 80%, and then next week we were at 20%, and then this week we're at 90%. And, you know, when we're all over the place, it's hard for me to say that they've met a goal. But if I can say that, you know, you'll hit this level on 4 consecutive assessments or something like that, I can have a lot more faith in saying, I think they've got it. I really think they've got it, because over and over again, they're showing me that they have it. So I'm going to show you some different goals, and I want to see what you think about these. Move my box over here. So Gail will correctly articulate all phonemes in spontaneous conversation with 90% accuracy and no cueing. So what's the skill that we're looking at?
Articulate the phonemes.
Okay, and that's a skill, right? You either can do that or you can't, to correctly say a specific sound. What kind of condition or material is going on here? I can see 2 different ones.
Well, one of them would be spontaneous conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I know the other one, but I'll let somebody else answer.
What do you guys think? Come on, John, help me out here.
Spontaneous conversation with 90% accuracy, no cueing. Yeah, I see the spontaneous conversation.
Uh-huh. So I expect to see or witness, hear the correct articulation of phonemes. I'm seeing it in the setting of spontaneous conversation. So I'm not worried about whether it's in something scripted or me giving you a word and I want you to say the word and get the sound right. I want to hear it in spontaneous conversation. And what's my other condition?
Well, there's accuracy. It has to be accurate. Well, no cueing.
No cueing, right? Because it's different if I say with no more than two cues or 2 verbal prompts, right? It's a different setup. So whether or not the student reaches the goal depends on me paying attention to these different things. So I want to see it in spontaneous conversation and with no cueing. If she can do that with 90% accuracy, so that's my criterion, then she's made the goal, right? Any way that you can make this goal better?
Well, as the way it's written, that would be every time there's a spontaneous conversation.
Okay.
So I would narrow that down to, like when you referenced, over so many consecutive, I don't know, you said assessments, but we could use that same kind of model for, opportunities or
observations.
Yeah.
Right.
In
Right,
a
because
20-minute therapy session.
if she does it once, is she there?
Right.
No.
According to the goal. Yeah.
That's true. That's true. So, I think when you look at any of your goals that you're writing and think about, okay, how do I know? How do I know that she's gotten there? That's hard. So let me show you another one. In a small group setting, Gail, poor Gail, we're working on these speech sounds with her. She'll say developmentally appropriate speech sounds. So her initial K, G, F, and B sounds. When creating a sentence, given a word or a picture with no cueing, 9 of 10 trials in 5 observations.
Yeah, that's a great goal.
Now, my only question about this goal is there a good understanding of 9 of 10 trials in 5 observations? I would interpret that to mean that when we sit down for an observation, I'm going to have you do 10 different sentences. And I'm hoping that you can use those appropriate speech sounds in 9 of 10 of them on 5 different times that I meet with you. But I think it's still a little sketchy. I mean, it's got some really good setup to it. But if you sit 2 SLPs down and they're not sure what exactly the 9 of 10 and in 5 observations means, then we've got a problem. So I think we're always just trying to make it as clear as possible to really come out with a measurable goal. Just a couple more. Given a 4th grade text, Marcy will correctly answer 8 out of 10 factual questions about the reading in 4 consecutive data collections. So what's the condition there?
It's a 4th grade text.
Yeah,
Right.
grade
Yeah, because Marcy could be a 4th grader, she could be a 6th grader, and we could be working on this goal. We don't know. But if we just said the Marcy will correctly answer and went on from there, that could be a very different situation if Marcy were to move down the road and someone didn't know that, man, she is way behind. And I really was just looking at her taking that below grade level text and being able to answer those questions. Okay, here's another one. Is Marcy reading it to herself or are we reading it to her?
Doesn't say.
No. So, I feel for a lot of people when they get an IEP and they're like, I'm not sure what to do. I'm not sure what to support or monitor. So those are the things that I would just suggest we're as specific as we can be. Marcy will answer WH questions using picture cues regarding a 3 to 4 sentence story given verbally with 80% accuracy. Talk to me about that one.
So we're reading it to her in that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Doesn't tell us the level of the story, but maybe that's not, like the other one, it was given a 4th grade level text.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you don't know if it's a story on at her grade level. You pretty much assume it unless you hear something different, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, is this once? Is it on, over so many trials? Whether it's consecutive trials or, 8 out of 10 assessments or, however it is that, again, you can feel a confidence level that she's got it. And we need to move on to something else. So, we think goal writing is easy, but it's not that easy. We have so many things to think about in order for it to be a very succinct goal. And this doesn't even get into, okay, now how are we going to collect this data? Because we don't collect data on our IEP goals every day, all day long. We're looking at those good opportunities to really collect something that tells us, did she do this or did she not? And most of the time we can use those assessments that are available in the classroom. If we can build what we're working on and a way to assess it based on what is already going to be happening, it saves a lot of time and energy. There's no reason that if assessments are already taking place that would answer our questions that we have, that we can't use those. I think sometimes we think, well, it's a motor goal, so the OT needs to collect that data. It's a language goal, the speech pathologist needs to collect that data. There are times when that is true because it may be a skill that we're looking for that really they've got the expertise to be able to recognize whether it happened or not, and maybe classroom teacher does not. But many times we're talking about things that can be easily observed within that general education classroom. And the more that we have our gen ed teachers helping to pull this data, the more that they cue into, oh yeah, we're working on that with this student. And when they're paying attention to it, they're naturally starting to support it and address it more than they would be when it's not fresh in their minds that, oh yeah, this kid has this need and we have to work on these things. All right, so I'm going to shift away from goals now and think about kind of the how do we do this? How do we make all this work? Because any of you who are providing these services or supervising others who are providing these services, we know that caseloads are crazy. Caseloads are high, schedules are tight, and not only are schedules tight because we've got big caseloads, some of you are itinerant where you're having to drive to different buildings. That cuts out a bunch of time that you could be serving kids. And then you get to the buildings and they say, oh yeah, but don't pull them out of reading. Don't pull them out of math, and don't pull them from recess. Don't touch lunchtime. This kid really loves art. Stay away from art. I want you to stay away from this. We end up with these tiny little pockets where we can serve kids without irritating someone, including the child and their parents, right? So we want to think about any time that we could provide something within those things, not pull them away from those things, but how can we support the skills that we are most interested in for these kids, but in a general education setting? So first we have to know the why. Why do we want to do this? What are some of these benefits? And this is the kind of information that you're going to want to be sharing with those that you've got to convince that this is actually a good thing to do, because you got to get some buy-in from others. You can't just go in and say, by the way, from now on, I'm going to be providing all of these in your class. There's got to be some convincing of the why behind this. Whenever we go in and work when other adults are there, number one, we're making sure that they are still there. You coming into a classroom does not mean a teacher leaves the classroom. You're coming in as an additional layer of support. They can hear and see what you do, which is some of what is missing in that pull-out setting. It's not that we have a magic wand in those separate rooms that we suddenly can do these magical things and kids go back and they have a skill. Well, many times they have a skill in our little office and they go back to the classroom and they're not utilizing those skills. And people wonder, well, could they really do it? We sometimes hear that. I've never seen them do that. I've never seen her be able to do this skill. So they can see things like, or hear how we reword things so that they make sense to a student, how we take directions and not just repeat them or repeat them louder and slower, but how we reword them using different vocabulary to send the same message. How we use visuals. We can make visuals, we can give them to the teacher to use, but there's a different layer of truly how do we appropriately use these. How we can take any lesson, social studies, science, art, anything that we're doing, and how we can incorporate some modeling for articulation that might benefit more kids than just the kids on your caseload. How we can appropriately correct a student without embarrassing them or calling them out. What physical movements do we use to identify or to help reinforce a particular skill? How do we support gross motor, fine motor, sensory regulation? How do we do that? So we can give a calm classroom kit to a teacher and say, you know, here's some things some sensory tools that students might be able to use. But if we don't demonstrate when we use them, how we use them, and the appropriate use for students, then they may just sit in the box, right? How do we support behavior? How do we support social skills within that larger setting? So again, I want you to think about the fact that you've got a caseload, you've got kids who you have to pay attention to, but those certainly aren't all of the kids that might benefit from your area of expertise. There are many kids who never get an IEP or a 504 or an ILP or any of those kinds of things because they didn't meet the criteria that were set by the law, but they still have needs. And sometimes their needs are even bigger than some of our kids who actually have a formal plan. So one of the ways that we can help do this is by thinking about co-teaching. And when you look at the true definition of co-teaching, it is two educators who are co-assessing, co-instructing, and co-planning. They're doing all of this stuff together. Now, that's a pure model, right? But if you take the same concepts and you take a teacher and instead of plugging in a special ed teacher, you may be plugging in somebody else and thinking about, yeah, we may not be able to do as much of the planning. We may not always co-instruct and we may not always co-assess, but we're using the thinking and the models to figure out how it is that I can layer my stuff that I'm responsible for making sure happens into what's already being taught in the classroom. So if you think about the different models, we're just going to skim through these pretty quickly. One of the models is one teach, one assist. And that is somebody's teaching and somebody else is supporting the rest of the group. So they may be helping to address behaviors. They may be going in and helping, maybe the teacher is teaching how to complete a worksheet that involves a lot of cutting and gluing. And as an occupational therapist, you're in there to go around and help the students who are struggling with how to hold the scissors correctly, how to use their hand to stabilize the paper and cut. There are things that you would work on in maybe a pullout setting that could be worked on when you know that there are certain activities happening in the classroom. And how to show the teacher then, here's how you do it. The watch me do it, here's how you do it. So that when you're not in there, they're hopefully doing things the way that you would have supported them. They're learning those skills. You're constantly building up the skill set. Generally, when this is used, it is used kind of in between other activities. So if you've got two fully qualified professionals in the classroom, you should be in some sort of a co-teaching model at all times. There's never one teach, one checks their phone, one teach, one shops on the internet, one teach, one is, using time to go make copies. It's always, we've got two people in here to support lots of kids, and we are in and out of different models. And one teach, one assist tends to flow in between the other models. The only thing that you really want to watch is making sure that when you're assisting other people, or if you're leading something and the teacher is assisting the students and kind of milling around and checking on them, that you're trying to keep it as minimally disruptive as possible. Sometimes when you get to talking with a student who needs your help, all eyes tend to go to you. And so you want to make sure and keep that as minimal as possible. Similarly, another model is one teach, one observe. And this could be a great opportunity for collecting data. You use it very similarly, but one person is instructing and the other person is either collecting data or kind of keeping an eye on how students might be struggling, because many of you might be able to observe and say, oh, I see where this kid is kind of, I see where the hitch is in their thinking and why they're struggling with this kind of activity. And you might be able to provide some feedback to whoever's instructing about how to change things up, how to change the pacing, how to use some different questions, how to lead up to this differently so that this kid is coming in at, in a state of readiness to learn. Alternative teaching tends to be kind of a large group, small group. Now that's oversimplifying it. But your large group and small group, again, there's nothing that prescribes specifically who's handling a large group and who's handling a small group. It depends on what your skill is that you're working on. But the small group could be a group for extension. It could be a group that is more of a remedial group or focusing on the same content, but learning it kind of in a different way, approaching it differently. It may be something like a pre-teaching kind of group that for any of you in speech pathology, we have a lot of students who need pre-taught vocabulary in order to really benefit from anything that's going on in the main lesson. And if we could just get that vocabulary there so they can anchor to it and understand what the words mean, the other stuff is going to make a lot more sense. Now, I can guarantee you that if you go into a classroom and you have two kids that really need that pre-teaching of vocabulary, you're going to find 3, 4, 5 more kids who aren't identified as having an IEP that could also be part of that group. So we want to make sure that any of the grouping that we do in that general education setting is as mixed as we can reasonably do it. It's not always going to fit that way, but think back to those Petri dish examples. You don't want to create the little circle within the gen ed room that is always the special ed student. I just can guarantee you're going to find either a couple other kids who need this or a couple other kids who maybe don't need it, but boy, they could be great role models within this group. They could help the other kids out. Many kids learn really well from kid speak. You can say the exact same thing, but get a kid to explain it and the student goes, oh, well, I get it now, right? So you want to be able to capitalize on all of the different things that are available to you. Parallel teaching is just splitting the group into two. We're always looking to get a lower student to teacher ratio. So if we can decrease that ratio and just split it up, we might be able to work in mixed groups, get the needs met, but be able to do it just in smaller groups. Smaller groups means a lot of different things. It means more opportunities for kids to talk, more opportunities for kids to engage with the materials that you're using or to participate when in a larger group they may not. Now, I guess one of the things to think about here is, are you confident enough in what is being taught during a lesson to be able to be one of the instructors in this? And if you're not, this is not a good time to do that. But again, if you're talking about a vocabulary lesson, that'd be a great thing. Or if you are a physical or occupational therapist and you want to lead a mindfulness activity and have the teacher leading a group and you leading a group, that might be a really good thing to do. Some behavior specialists working on social skills. You can split those groups up to be able to have more interaction and conversation. Teaming is a little bit different, and this is many of the trainings that we do. We have 2 trainers, and it's not that we just divide up the content. We're both delivering content, and maybe I start off talking about something and one of my colleagues will add some things in. There are some topics that might lend themselves very well to some teaming. And again, thinking about your own roles. How could your expertise layer on to what's being taught during that lesson? Is it supporting vocabulary? Is it the person who jumps in and says, and another way to say this would be this, after the teacher has explained something, but you're working together in delivering the lesson. This can be, it can be a really good strategy to use, but it can also, it can be difficult for our youngest kids because following 2 people and 2 voices, it's hard to know what to pay attention to. So younger kids, kids who are on the autism spectrum, or kids who have extreme attention difficulties can sometimes struggle with this. So just, thinking about the most appropriate choices for how we deliver services. And then finally, and this is the place where I think you can probably see the most opportunities, is in doing station teaching, because this really might allow you to take your own area, your own expertise, and create a station that addresses that. Now, again, let's think about a classroom full of kids, and maybe you are doing a station and you're the occupational therapist, and as kids move around, mixed groups come to you, and one group that comes to you has 2 kids that are working on fine motor skills. You support them through an activity that anytime there's fine motor needed, you're helping them, right? You're sharing what you would normally do in that more pull-out kind of setting to support a couple of kids within that group. And the other kids may be able to do the activity without as much support. Then that group moves on, and maybe another group comes to you, and you've got one kid in this group that's also on your caseload for sensory regulation. And so you're still working through that same activity, the same group, but when this kid starts to struggle, you may work on, okay, remember, you have these 3 different tools at your disposal for helping to pull this together. What do you want to do? Allowing them that choice, getting them prepped for the activity. But again, you're providing services to multiple kids, but you're making sure that you're helping to address the IEP goals for the kids who are on your caseload as well. So just a quick quiz on this. So if you've got an SLP or a service provider who's teaching an entire class, right? And the classroom teacher is keeping data, what model would that be? Absolutely. One teach, one observe, or one teach, one collect data. SLP or service provider and the classroom teacher are teaching the lesson together. Teaming or teamamag, teaming. Students in small groups with or without their typically developing peers. Station teaching. And keep that in mind too. There are times, I mean, I encourage you when you do things like that to mix it up. But there may be a particular lesson where you specifically want certain kids who have a very, very specific need just this one day to be in a group all their own. It is okay to do that every now and then. What you don't want is for that to be the rule, that to be every time my kids come back here to this table and we're going to do this. You're looking at grouping kids and having them run through all of the different rotations. And then SLP or service provider working alongside or providing support for students while the teacher is instructing. And that would be one teach, one assist. All right. This graphic, I really like this graphic because it just helps you to think a little bit more about how we can do things differently. This was specifically designed thinking about speech and language pathology, but really you could apply it to anything. If you think about all of the different ways that we might be able to provide those services, they run on a continuum of how much collaboration really needs to happen in order for that to be successful. Obviously, if you're team teaching, you're going to have to plan this with your classroom teacher. If you're doing pull-out services, there's not a lot of collaboration that needs to happen. There's still some, right? Because most of you will ask your teachers, what are y'all doing in class? I want to make sure and I support that. I build on that. What vocabulary are you talking about so that I can work on that when I'm working with the students? Those kinds of things. So collaboration needs, as well as how much integration into the general ed classroom there is, and the benefit of other students. The benefit that other students may get from you being in there and providing those services. So there's some cost associated, some time costs, some resources to trying to make this happen. But there's also some big payoffs that can happen as well. So where to even start? Well, again, start small. Start with thinking about that one teacher that might be open to doing some of this, that might be open to doing station teaching once a week with you. You know, then you can kind of expand from there. But just thinking about, are there particular groups of kids that I might feel more comfortable with providing these services in the classrooms? Now, I know when I worked for quite a while working with a lot of preschool SLPs, and there was a whole lot of bubble blowing and pinwheel blowing and using mirrors and looking at the way that you form your mouth. And there were just so many things that looked to me like so much fun to do, but they're things that may be a little bit more difficult to do in a general ed setting because kids tend to stick out a little bit more when they do those things. But think about, are there things that you feel like would be appropriate for the whole class to see or do? Are there things that can build on some of the lessons that are happening? So again, you're going to think about the different environments or grade levels or a particular school that you're in. Where are some of the openings that you might be able to get your foot in that door? And then thinking about the scheduling. And this sounds like a scheduling nightmare, but I'm telling you, it opens up a lot of different doors that were previously closed to you. Places where it might make sense. So let's think about some of those things. Those related arts and elective classes that you've been told, stay away from those. Those might be great places. Think about how much is involved with motor skills in an art class, with motor skills in a PE class. What's going on in music class or If you're talking about secondary, even, are there supports that can happen in some of those allied arts kind of classes, such as even shop class, right? Are there things that can happen there? Your behavior support people. Some of the things that can happen in those different settings are prime areas for you to support behavior, because there are many times when it's not just sit here and listen to a lecture and then do some independent work and then clear out. It's moving around the room. It's interacting with peers. It's things where we would naturally see some of those behavioral skills need to be in place, some of the social interaction that needs to happen. Recess and lunch, again, is another time where there's so much happening socially, motor, communication, all of those different areas that are so important. For any of you OTs, well, for any of you at all who have ever worked in an elementary setting, if you walk around the lunch tables, you have so many little hands that pop up. I can't open my milk. Can you help me undo this? Can you do this for me? I can't close this. I can't open this. There's so much teaching that can happen during that time. And many of your kids are going to have some of those underlying skills that you could be working on while demonstrating things for the other adults that are there as well. A lot of the skills that you can provide are going to cut across language arts, math, social studies, science. So really, this can leave just about any content or any time open for you to be able to schedule kids into. So again, I think the scheduling has to do with all of the opportunities, but then let's think beyond our traditional way of writing services. Let's think beyond 20 minutes, 6 times a month. Let's think beyond the schedule being math is 60 minutes, and so we write services for 60 minutes. That may not be what is needed in order to provide the support for a student to reach the goal. So again, we start with present levels of performance. We design goals that trickle out of that present level. And then the services are all about, what do you think it's going to take in order for a student to be able to reach these goals? So you should expect to see very different things written on different kids' IEPs based on the dosage of service that they need. And if you can think smaller in terms of, I'm going to go in and provide services for a half an hour in this class, but then I can take that second half an hour and go into a different classroom and provide services there. Now, in order to make that happen, you're going to have good communication with those 2 different classroom teachers to say, can you make sure that the activities that would be appropriate for me to support are happening at the beginning of this class and at the end of this class? So there's still some finesse to it. But you can stagger things out in that way and be able to get more students seen. I think one of the questions that has come up anytime that we have done this training face-to-face has to do with Medicaid billing. And I can honestly tell you, I don't have the answers. Now, the participant answers at any of these trainings were that it doesn't matter. If you've got a group and you have 2 kids that have an IEP in your group, and you have 3 kids who don't have an IEP, you can still bill for the services that you are providing to those 2 students in that group. It's not I need to sit beside you for this many minutes in order to provide this. Some of what you're providing is more indirect. You're providing, again, modeling and demonstration for the teacher. You may be providing coaching for the teacher in, here's how I do this. Now, let me see you do it and I'll give you some feedback. But there are a lot of different ways to get all of these things accomplished. Another thing that you can really do is say, okay, let me see your lesson plan and let me think about where the students that I tend to work with, where they are likely to struggle and what I could maybe do to weave my skill set into what you already have planned. Because again, you can't sit and do co-planning for every teacher that you work with in a gen ed setting. You just need to know what they have planned so that you can add on to that. You can enhance what they're doing in order to help meet those IEP goals and make sure that that specially designed instruction is happening. So communication is definitely the key. And sometimes our communication looks like this, and we need to streamline that as much as possible. But there's a lot going on in schools. There's a lot to figure out. Definitely share those positive messages. Share that, you know, what I'm doing, if I do it in the classroom, it can help many kids. And we can make sure that what we're working on in the special ed world is affecting what happens on a daily basis. And we're hoping for more generalization. So again, check out those resources that are in the Padlet to be able to see some things that you could share with staff, some of the wording that you might be able to use. You can talk a little bit about things like least restrictive environment, you know, why this is a good thing, differentiated instruction, getting around some of the stigma issues, making sure that we're generalizing and making things meaningful, that we're not working on teaching a skill that really isn't going to make a difference. You never want to say a kid met an IEP goal and then think to yourself, so what? It has to be they met that IEP goal and now we've moved a step forward. It's really going to be appropriate for this student. So you may need to have some discussions with your teachers about, you know, when can we talk? When is it good for you? You know, what is kind of your philosophy on education? Because you are walking into an established classroom and you're not going to be in there a lot, right? So you have to think about, how are we going to make all this happen? What do we do when a kid has a question? When a kid says, can I go to the bathroom? Am I allowed to tell them yes or no, or do they have to go through you? We've got to work out some of the logistics of that. How are we going to communicate this with families? And this is just one example of how we might work with, or how we might share information with families. Because what we don't want to do is spend lots of time giving great support in a classroom and doing things that we feel good about, and then having either a teacher or a parent say, okay, yeah, but when's my child going to get their therapy, right? Well, they just got a ton of it. And this happens a lot. You have teachers that you may go in and provide support in the classroom, and then they say, okay, are you going to take him now? No, I'm doing this instead. And when you're providing services within that general education setting and with their general ed peers, and you're not segregating them out, then your services can actually be listed as GE instead of SE on the IEP. So the bottom line is, what really truly matters? Again, does it matter if I make everyone happy? Does it matter? It does matter if I meet the IEP minutes, right? They're on there. They're a promise to parents of what we expect to do for your child. I want kids to reach their goals. I want to create IEPs that are defensible and that I don't have to worry about being called into court over. But the underlying what matters is the student and positive outcomes for students, and knowing that what you do truly does make a difference and is helping that student to become a more well-rounded person who's on the path to independence and employment, and all of those other things that we want to have happen for them. And I think as we shift things into the real world, which is the gen ed classroom, we're working more towards that. We know that there's no special ed McDonald's, there's no special ed Walmart. There's no job where you go in and, you only do certain things in a segregated kind of way. We're in the real world. And I want my neighborhood to look like a mix of people. I want, the people I encounter in stores to be a mix of people. And I want my classrooms to be a good mix of people that learn to interact with each other. All right. Unfortunately, our time is up. Those 90-minute sessions just fly. I would ask that you complete an evaluation for the session, and you can just use your phone and use the camera and scan the QR code on the left, and that will take you right to the evaluation, and you just pull it from the drop-down menu that the goals for SLPs and related services. And the scan on the right will take you to our catalog, which will just show you some additional training opportunities that are out there. Many of them are virtual at this point, but there are some things that are still in person. We do have our Focus on Inclusion conference coming up at the beginning of February, and registration is not open for that yet, but it is our 10-year anniversary of this training. We are planning for it to be in person, and it's going to be huge. It does come with a cost, but that comes with food. And I would encourage you to keep your eyes out for that, because it's a training unlike anything that you've ever seen. National experts coming in for this. So check out those two opportunities. Here is my contact information, and you are welcome to reach out to me anytime by text or call or email. And then here are some additional ways that you can find information on our website. I would definitely encourage you to really look at our YouTube channel. There are many recorded trainings that are available on our YouTube channel that you won't find directly on our website. But if you either go to this address or click the little YouTube icon in the upper right-hand corner of our website, you'll find lots of different information. And then finally, we are part of the Indiana Resource Network. And we have other great organizations around the state that provide support to schools all over the state. So check these out as well. You can find out a little bit more about these at their individual websites. So thank you guys very much. Also, thank you to our captioner today, Jamie, and we will hope to see you next time.